Start. I'm Dave Briggs.
I'm Christine Romans. It is Tuesday, August 15th. It is 4 a.m. in the East. Nice to see y'all this morning. Up first, better late than never, or is it too little too late? President Trump finally responding after 2 days of harsh criticism from all directions in the wake of the hate-filled violence in Charlottesville that left 3 people dead. The president issuing a brief statement Monday. He began with a boast about the economy and what he said were all of his accomplishments, before delivering a full-throated condemnation of hate groups.
As I said on Saturday, we condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence. It has no place in America. Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans. To anyone who acted criminally in this weekend's racist violence, you will be held fully accountable. Justice will be delivered.
Strong statement on Monday, but as a reminder, this was President Trump's initial response on Saturday to the violence in Charlottesville.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
All right, let's get more now from CNN's Sarah Murray at the White House.
Good morning, Christine and Dave. The president only clarifying his stance after days of backlash, not just from some of his backers on Wall Street and not just from Democrats, but also from members of his own party, as it appears clear that the White House and Trump's advisors were caught flat-footed by the developments. Now, when President Trump was asked why it took him days to condemn these actions by white nationalists, he said only that they are condemned. But that explanation rang hollow to some, in part because this is a president who has repeatedly fumbled his efforts to denounce the white nationalists that have rallied in his name. Remember, it took him multiple attempts to say he disavowed the support of David Duke, a former KKK leader. This is a president that at different points has retweeted white supremacists, and this is also someone who rose to prominence in part by questioning whether President Barack Obama, the first African-American president, was born in the United States. These are some things that lead people to believe that there are more nefarious efforts underway behind this delay in President Trump's comments, and an indication that this controversy is not going to evaporate from the White House anytime soon. Back to you guys.
All right, you're absolutely right, Sarah Murray. Thank you for that. The president, arriving at Trump Tower in New York last night, his first time back since taking office. He was greeted by a swarm of protesters shouting messages like "no hate" and "impeach." The president turning to Twitter to vent, and in doing so, he sparked a new controversy. So just hours ago, late last night, like 11 o'clock, he retweeted a post from a prominent alt-right activist. He retweeted someone best known for indulging in outrageous conspiracy theories. The post questioned why the media was covering the Charlottesville story instead of violence in Chicago.
The president has been under fire for not specifically rejecting the support of white supremacy groups or immediately calling them out by name. He has not explained why. Listen to this exchange with CNN's Jim Acosta.
Mr. President, can you explain why you did not condemn those hate groups by name over the weekend?
They've been condemned. They have been condemned.
And why are we not having a press conference today? You said on Friday we'd have a press conference.
We had a press conference. We just had a press conference.
Can we ask you some more questions then, sir?
It doesn't bother me at all, but I like real news, not fake news. You're fake news.
That was not a press conference. That was a statement on camera. That was not a press conference.
The semantics of that are absolutely true. He'll get a sense of what a press conference is, perhaps if he has a communications director.
Yeah,
but
maybe.
Time will tell if we get one of those. The president followed up that exchange with this Twitter attack on the press. Quote, made additional remarks on Charlottesville and realized once again that the fake news media will never be satisfied. Truly bad people. But let's get back to that fake news moniker for just one moment. You just reminded us that he retweeted someone who trolls in the Pizzagate theory, which is truly the definition of what fake news is. So
and
just
the definition
fact check.
of the alt-right firing people up. You know, I mean, somebody came to a pizza parlor, a legitimate pizza parlor, because of something that he had read online. It's remarkable, and this is the kind of milieu that the president lives with online. Fascinating.
Just an ordinary day.
Just an ordinary day. That's right. Our business leaders are not happy with President Trump's response to Charlottesville, not at all. And 3 CEOs quit his manufacturing council as a result. The heads of Intel and Under Armour are stepping down, following the lead of one of America's most prominent black CEOs, Merck chief Kenneth Frazier. Frazier quit the council after Trump's initial failure to condemn white supremacy, saying that America's leaders must clearly reject hatred, bigotry, and group supremacy. Still, the CEOs of Intel and Under Armour, they quit even after the president later called neo-Nazis repugnant. So after that 2-day late presidential strong response, they still stepped down from the president's advisory councils. Corporate America is quick to rebuke Trump on many issues, including on immigration and climate change, but very few CEOs have broken with the White House, perhaps because their companies and their stocks still benefit from Trump's pro-business environment. There are a few exceptions. The former Uber CEO left the president's council after his travel ban. The Disney CEO Bob Iger and the Tesla founder Elon Musk, they quit after breaking with the Paris Climate Agreement. But CNN asked 24 execs on the Manufacturing Council if they would stay. While those that responded denounced hatred, at least 7 companies said that they would remain, including Dow Chemical, Whirlpool, Campbell Soup, and General Electric. They cite the importance of participating in the discussion on U.S. manufacturing. And I have talked to some of these business leaders in months past about, you know, what they get from sitting in that photo op with the spray of the cameras next to the president when they disagree with him on so many things.
Sure.
Some of them want a voice at the table to maybe moderate the president, maybe help advise him better, they think, on some of these issues that they care about. But some others have complained that it was kind of a waste of their time, you know, to fly all the way across the country to sit down with the president who only wants to talk about himself and his accomplishments. So it's interesting to see how corporate America is responding here.
It sure is. All right, James Fields, meanwhile, the 20-year-old Ohio man accused of plowing his car into a crowd of Charlottesville demonstrators, is being held without bond this morning, and we're finding out more about him. Here's CNN's Brian Todd.
Christine and Dave, suspect James Fields made his first court appearance. He was video linked into the courtroom on Monday morning from his jail cell in Charlottesville, outside Charlottesville, actually. The judge told him about his charges, which include 1 count of second-degree murder, 3 counts of malicious wounding, and a hit-and-run charge. He asked James Fields if he could afford an attorney. James Fields said he could not afford an attorney. And interestingly, the judge then said he could not appoint a public defender for James Fields because a member of the public defender's office had a relative who was affected by Saturday's violence. So the judge went down his list and appointed an attorney named Charles Weber to represent James Fields. And we moved on with the proceedings there. We reached out to Charles Weber for comment on this case, and we have not heard back from him. Also, on Monday, we got word from a security firm in Ohio that James Fields had worked for that firm, a firm called Securitas. They said he worked for them from May until July of 2016, and then from November of 2016 until the present. That firm said that he took a vacation leave to come here to Charlottesville, and that he has since been terminated. Christine and Dave.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Brian. So the mother of the Charlottesville victim, Heather Heyer, talking to CNN. Here's what Susan Bro told our Anderson Cooper what she would say to James Fields, the driver who allegedly plowed into a group of protesters, killing her daughter.
You took my child from me, and I'm going to be the voice that she can no longer be. And so you gave us a national forum, and maybe I should thank you for that, but I can't. I would rather have my child.
Just heartbreaking. She also told us how she wants her daughter to be remembered.
She would want that spark of self-examination, of the honest discourse, of being able to explain yourself, to make yourself accountable, to continue on. If anything is ever to come of this Say Her Name, I want it to be that Say Her Name means you hold yourself accountable. You check your actions before you do something. You explain yourself to God, to yourself, to another person, whatever you have to do, but you hold yourself accountable before you go after somebody. And there's no excuse for hatred. There's no excuse for bigotry. There's no excuse for discrimination.
Meanwhile, the hate-filled violence sparking protesters in North Carolina to take down a Confederate statue outside the courthouse in Durham.
Ain't no fascist USA!
Yeah, they attached a rope to the statue memorializing Confederate soldiers and pulled it down. North Carolina's governor responded in a tweet saying, "The racism and deadly violence in Charlottesville is unacceptable, but there is a better way to remove these monuments." Durham police say no arrests were made, noting the incident occurred on county property where county law enforcement has jurisdiction. Meantime, the governor of Arizona says he 100% condemns white supremacist hate groups, but he has no plans to remove Confederate monuments from state grounds.
It's not my desire or mission to tear down any monuments or memorials. We have a public process for this. If the public wants to be engaged in this, I'd invite them to get engaged in it. I don't think we should try to hide our history. I think we ought to try to teach it and make people understand we've overcome a lot of mistakes.
Arizona has 6 Confederate memorials. Look for this, Christine, to spread throughout the country. It's sort of a litmus test of where you stand on this issue. Should we tear down these Confederate monuments? Let us know what you think at Early Start on Twitter.
And it's a flashpoint for something bigger, you know, that, you know, opportunity in this country and fairness. And it's the physical thing, the monuments, but there's something else going on around there.
Debate
too.
is far from over.
All right, 12 minutes past the hour. Game on. Defense Secretary Mattis warning North Korea over threats at the U.S. North Korea now the threats may be backing off.
North Korea backing off its threat to launch a missile attack on Guam. State-run media saying Kim Jong-un has finished reviewing an attack plan and will hold off on a decision depending on what the, quote, foolish Yankees do next. The statement coming just hours after Secretary of Defense James Mattis warned that if North Korea fired on the U.S. territory, it would be, quote, game on. Meantime, South Korea's president says his government is determined to resolve tensions on the Korean peninsula peacefully. CNN's Paula Hancock's live for us in Seoul with the latest. Good morning to you, Paula. It's not often we hear Kim Jong-un back off on a threat, maybe a small win for the president here.
Well, potentially, yes, Dave. We did hear that Kim Jong-un was going to have this plan ready for these 4 missiles to hit the waters off Guam. He's had that plan. He's looked over it, according to state-run media, very carefully with his generals, and now he is waiting to see what the Americans do. Now, clearly, that is a reference, or likely a reference, to next week. The South Koreans and the US are going to have joint military drills next week, starting August 21st. They go on for 10 days. They happen every year. The US says they're defensive in nature, but that is quite simply not the way that North Korea sees it. They see them as provocative, and every single time they are incensed by these military drills. So it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is after those drills go ahead. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Dunford said, they will go ahead. In fact, there was more of a need for them now than ever before. We also heard from the South Korean President Moon Jae-in here in Seoul today. It's Liberation Day. North and South Korea actually celebrating the same occasion, on the same side for once, the liberation from Japanese occupation. And he said there will be no second Korean war. He was insistent that he would not allow war to break out on the Korean peninsula, said it is up to South Korea to decide what military action happens on the Korean peninsula, and says that the US is on the same page as South Korea. And then, of course, at the same time, you had the Secretary of Defense saying that if North Korea attacks first, it is game on. Dave.
Indeed. Paula Hancock's live for us in Seoul this morning. Thank you.
18 minutes past the hour. China is threatening to retaliate now that President Trump's chief trade negotiator has been asked to determine whether an investigation of Beijing's trade practices is needed. The move could pave the way for the president to impose tariffs on Chinese imports. The administration turning the screws on China in order to get more cooperation on the North Korea crisis. Let's go live to Hong Kong and bring in CNN's David McKenzie. China might be complaining, but is this less harsh than people expected from the Trump administration?
Good morning, Christine. Yes, I think so. I think many people expected this investigation to be launched straight away, but the trade representative of Trump has about a year to investigate possible infringement of U.S. Intellectual property rights within China, something people have complained for a very long time. So I think it's sort of stepping off the pedal a little bit, perhaps to gain China's help on North Korea, Christine.
Complaints are very long. I mean, the number of CEOs I know who I've talked to who build a factory or do a joint venture in China and then turn around and 5 miles down the road, there's the exact same factory that has been just sprung up, making their goods, but under different brand names or something. I mean, this is something that they've really been concerned about. And cyber espionage and intellectual property theft through spying. These are all accusations that the administration has had for years. What do you hear from U.S. executives about the subject?
Well, Christine, you're absolutely right. I've heard those same complaints. And sometimes you have a joint venture with a U.S. company, a Chinese company, and just sort of lo and behold, a few months later or years later, you have an almost identical product hitting the Chinese market with the U.S. companies, it seems almost identical. So, yes, it is a complaint. And it costs the U.S. more than $200 billion a year, according to a recent study. So there's a lot of pressure on the Trump administration to help solve this problem. But they're looking at the big picture, I think, and want to be deliberate about it. The Chinese say that it's such a complex economy, complex linkages between the U.S. and Chinese economy that any push against China could result in a cascade effect that would ultimately, they say, hurt the U.S. Consumer. So it's a complicated issue, but yes, there's been complaints for a very long time. Christine?
Yeah, I mean, let's be very fair here. The American consumers for years have had very low prices because of America's trade relationship with China. Companies complain, but boy, they all are, I mean, they get big revenue in China as well. So it'll be interesting to see, David, if there's anything different this time around from prior administrations when they've tried to address some of these prickly issues with the Chinese. David McKenzie, thank you so much for that in Hong Kong this morning.
Boy, some tenuous times in the region.
Oh, yeah.
A trade war with China at the same time with the nuclear confrontation with North Korea. All right, a lot of people talking about the Taylor Swift trial. Vindication, though, for Taylor Swift.
It takes people like Taylor, wonderful people like Taylor, who we all know, to stand up and draw these lines.
A jury ruling for the singer in court. We'll have the details next.
Introducing.
Following the breaking news, President Trump finally denouncing racist and hate groups by name after 2 days of stinging criticism for his initial response to a rally by white nationalists that turned violent in Charlottesville, Virginia. We'll have much more on that coming up. But also breaking right now, North Korea just issuing a new warning to the United States that Kim Jong-un has reviewed a plan to launch missiles at the U.S. territory of Guam. Let's go to our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto. Jim, what is the very latest?
Well, this report coming from the North Korean state news agency describing the North Korean leader visiting the forces that would carry out this threatened launch against Guam, also at the same time issuing what appeared to be something of a response to President Trump's rhetoric in recent days. The North Korean leader quoted as saying that he would, quote, watch a little more the foolish and stupid conduct of the Yankees. This coming little more than an hour after the U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis told reporters at the Pentagon that if North Korea were to fire missiles anywhere near Guam, it would be, in his words, game on. That, in contrast to more diplomatic tone coming from General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is now traveling in Asia and visited the Korean Peninsula. On a visit to the front lines of the North Korean conflict today, the nation's top general emphasized diplomacy and economic pressure over military action.
The focus today is on peacefully resolving this crisis through diplomatic and economic means. That is the focus, and I wouldn't speculate on what might happen should our diplomatic and economic efforts fail.
China, the North's primary trading partner by far, is now adding to that pressure, announcing a new ban on imports from Pyongyang. China's Ministry of Commerce announced that beginning Tuesday, quote, China will impose a complete ban on the importation of coal, iron, iron ore, lead ore, and seafood. President Trump has publicly threatened trade penalties on China if it does not increase pressure on North Korea. Beijing has responded by saying a potential trade war, quote, has no future or winners. Still, the White House is doubling down on a firmer line against North Korea's nuclear program. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Defense Secretary James Mattis laid out the administration's approach in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, calling for the end of strategic patience and beginning of strategic accountability. Traveling in South America, Vice President Mike Pence delivered the same message.
Successive administrations in both political parties have believed that negotiation and patience with North Korea would achieve the long-term objective of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That has utterly failed.
North Korea, however, continues to issue threats, warning that upcoming joint military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea, planned to begin next week, could spark a war. What matters, said the Korean Central News Agency, is that when a second Korean War breaks out, it would be a nuclear war. For his part, Secretary Maddow told reporters today that if North Korea attacks any U.S. territory, the U.S. would respond with military action.
If they shoot at the United States, I'm assuming they hit the United States. If they do that, then it's game on.
This after CIA Director Mike Pompeo seemed to be allaying fears of an escalation this weekend.
An attack from North Korea is not something that is imminent.
U.S. officials do warn that North Korea is making significant progress. One new study found that their advancement in rocket engine technology could mean that they're acquiring it through illicit Russian or Ukrainian channels.
It appears that they sourced an engine from a foreign entity, and they have successfully incorporated that engine into some missile bodies and have tested both an intermediate range and an intercontinental range missile.
Defense officials tell CNN that U.S. surveillance satellites have detected signs that North Korea has mounted what appears to be an intermediate ballistic missile on a mobile launcher. Dates, celebrations forever important in North Korea. And we should note that tomorrow is a key holiday, Liberation Day for the North, and those missile preparations could be intended to either mark that holiday or make a show of force for next week's military exercises. Wolf?
Yeah, between the U.S. and South Korea, the North Koreans hate those. Jim Sciutto reporting for us. Thanks very much. Let's bring in the former Director of National Intelligence, General James Clapper. He's now a CNN National Security Analyst. General Clapper, thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks, Wolf.
All right, so the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, supposedly has been briefed on this plan to launch intermediate range missiles toward the U.S. territory of Guam. He says he would watch a little more the foolish and stupid conduct of the Yankees. Is this just bluster, or is there a real threat to the folks on Guam?
Well, obviously, that's a great question. I personally think that this is more bluster. It is the classic North Korean propaganda verbiage that they typically use. And I do think it's important to bear in mind the circumstance here with the onset of the annual joint exercise held between the United States and Republic of Korea forces, which the North Koreans find quite threatening. And so I think it wouldn't surprise me if they did a demonstration launch just to convey the optic.
Demonstration launch towards Guam. They said the other day, as you remember, by mid-August, they might launch 4 intermediate range missiles towards Guam, and they would land about 20 miles off the coast. First of all, do they have that precision? And do you believe they might do that?
I don't think they have that kind of precision yet. I wonder about their own confidence level to launch 1, let alone 4. So I would think at this point they would be staying away from aiming at in any direction remotely related to Guam.
You saw that story in the Washington Post the other day that they may already, according to U.S. intelligence estimates, have 60 nuclear bombs, and that they pretty soon will be able to miniaturize those bombs and put them on warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles. You buy that?
Well, we forecast that their general line of progression here, and this is a forecast of 2 or 3 years ago, and now we're seeing this happen, particularly as they aggressively pursue missile technology. I won't go into speculating about the number. That's always been a range of estimates. But I think it's clear that the North Koreans are very committed to achieving a nuclear capability, credible nuclear capability, because, as I pointed out before, this is their ticket to survival. This is deterrence for them.
They're not going to give up that nuclear capability. They see that as their insurance.
Exactly. I think it's very unlikely that going in, certainly, are establishing as a condition for negotiation, you must denuclearize first. I tried that talking point myself and got absolutely nowhere.
When we spoke at the Aspen Security Forum in Colorado a couple of weeks ago, you said you don't consider North Korea yet an existential threat in the same way that Russia is. Explain that.
Well, if you look at the magnitude and sophistication of the Russian nuclear arsenal, which is comparable in size and capability to ours, there's no comparison between what the Russian capability is versus North Korea.
But you don't believe Russia's it's not even realistic to think Russia would start a nuclear war with the U.S., but a lot of people believe North Korea might.
Well, I think there's a big difference between when you speak of an existential threat, there are actually a couple dimensions here. One is the capability, which clearly the Russians have to wreak great death and destruction on the United States if they so chose. Don't think the intent's there. You have to also consider, though, the other capabilities they have, notably in the cyber arena, which are the most sophisticated threat that's posed to us.
You're talking about Russia.
I'm talking about Russia, much more so than Korea. Korea is kind of the second tier and improving. But I think the ability of the North Koreans to launch a existential attack, a threat attack of that magnitude is just not there.
General Clapper, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Will.
We'll keep counting on you for your expertise in this area. Just ahead, we're following the breaking news as President Trump finally speaks out against hate groups after the Charlottesville, Virginia violence.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
News, take a look at this. Protesters are outside Trump Tower in New York City right now. They're awaiting the president's return later this evening. The president earlier today, he declined to explain why he waited 2 days to condemn the specific racist groups involved in this weekend's violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. Several hours earlier, the president read this statement at the White House.
The Department of Justice has opened a civil rights investigation into the deadly car attack that killed one innocent American and wounded 20 others. To anyone who acted criminally in this weekend's racist violence, you will be held fully accountable. Justice will be delivered. Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
All right, let's bring in our specialist, Chris Cillizza. His critics are already saying too little, too late. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's hard not to agree, Ken. If this was, I was saying to Rebecca off camera, I mean, this is literally a layup underneath the hoop. There's no one around. All you need to do is say what my 5-year-old knows, which is we abhor racists and their hate. This is not a country that we're going to tolerate bigotry in. And you say neo-Nazis, white supremacists, I say they identify with me. I don't identify with them. This isn't any part of any political ideology or system that I subscribe to. He didn't do that, number one. And what he did do is say, the thing about on many sides, essentially
That's what he said
on Saturday. So did he come back and do better today? Yes. Were there still parts of that I found strange, most notably that he led a speech about Charlottesville with a paragraph about the economy and how well it's doing? Yes. Sometimes in politics, you do get that one chance when sort of the focus is on you. It's going to be hard for anyone, I think, even people who support Donald Trump, who I've talked to say, oh, yeah, this was his initial reaction 48 hours later. When we saw his initial reaction, and it seems to me inadequate in terms of how we define what we want out of presidential leadership.
Was it inappropriate that he began his statement today with some comments about unemployment, jobs, the economy?
Well, that's Donald Trump, Wolf. We've seen this from him before. We are seeing it from him today. And certainly that is the conversation that Donald Trump in this situation likely would prefer to be having. He doesn't want to be talking about racial issues. And as we saw during the campaign, if he is talking about race, ethnicity, usually it's to use those issues as some kind of wedge. Donald Trump, for him, I think we've seen on multiple occasions during his presidency, he's had trouble transitioning from candidate mode to president mode. And there are times in the presidency when you do have to be this figure of moral authority, when you need to inspire the nation, show some moral leadership. And we didn't really see that from him over these past few days.
Jeffrey Toobin, the president, also said that the Department of Justice has now formally opened a civil rights investigation into that car assault. How strong would that federal case be?
Well, it would be different from a straightforward murder case, which sounds like it would be easy to make, and the Commonwealth of Virginia is certainly opening that as well. You know, I mean, in these circumstances, the federal intervention is more symbolic than real. If in fact this terrible man intentionally drove the car into the crowd, as certainly seems to be the case, he's going to go to prison for the rest of his life or suffer the death penalty, whether the federal government intervenes or not. It is certainly an important symbol for the Justice Department to say they are also investigating this. But in terms of a practical effect, this guy is not going anywhere, regardless of which jurisdiction happens to be investigating.
Would it be appropriate for the Justice Department to also open up an investigation into domestic terrorism?
Well, that is, I mean, it would be, the Justice Department would investigate the whole incident, and they would then decide which charges are most relevant. Terrorism is certainly a possibility. As I say, first-degree murder or second-degree murder in terms of the local charges would be appropriate. I don't think there is any doubt that this man is going to be prosecuted. The question, I think, much more interesting and much more difficult is whether the Justice Department is going to start surveillance on these groups, which they have, conservatives have objected to a great deal. They want all the energy on jihadist terrorism. Will there be the kind of continuing scrutiny of right-wing groups as well as jihadist groups? That's a much more touchy and poignant political question.
Well, let me ask Chief Ramsey. That's a good question for you. You're a former police chief here in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia. Would it be appropriate to start some domestic surveillance of these hate groups, these white supremacist, neo-Nazi, KKK type of groups?
Well, if they're active in your area, and there are many areas where they are active, if you get information that they might be plotting or planning something, that would be appropriate, in my opinion.
Do you know if there have been these kinds of surveillance programs over the years, Chief?
Oh, I don't know, but I imagine so, depending on the circumstances, the information that comes to the attention of law enforcement. Any group that may engage in criminal activity, you certainly would want to keep an eye on them and prevent it from happening.
See if that gets started. You go ahead, Jeffrey.
But Wolf, I mean, there was that sort of scrutiny early in the Obama administration, and Republicans in Congress were furious about it because they thought it was, political intimidation. So, I mean, this will be much more interesting and important than whether this particular person is prosecuted, who's certainly going to be prosecuted. The question is, will there be further Justice Department scrutiny of alt-right groups? That's an important question, and that will be an important thing for Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General.
Well, we'll see how the White House and the Attorney General deal with that. Everybody stick around. Don't go too far away. During the past hour, Charlottesville Police Chief defended his department. Take a look at this, some live pictures coming in from outside Trump Tower in New York City. The president will be there later tonight, but protesters, significant numbers, have already gathered outside. The president clearly facing withering criticism for his initially weak response to the hate group violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. He finally condemned the KKK, white supremacists, neo-Nazis by name earlier this afternoon, saying racism is evil. This, by the way, will be the first time since becoming president on January 20th that Mr. Trump will be back at Trump Tower, spending the night in New York City. First time in more than 200 days. We're back with Democratic Congressman Cedric Richmond, a member of both the Judiciary and Homeland Security Committees and chairman of the Congressional Black caucus. Congressman, the Merck pharmaceutical CEO, Kenneth Frazier, one of the most prominent African-American CEOs in the country, he quit the president's manufacturing council today. He released a statement saying, and I'm quoting him now, America's leaders must honor our fundamental values by clearly rejecting expressions of hatred, bigotry, and group supremacy. And within only a few minutes, the president tweeted this, now that Ken Frazier of Merck Pharma has resigned from President's Manufacturing Council, he will have more time to lower ripoff drug prices. So, Congressman, what do you make of the president's attack on Mr. Frazier?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's petty. It's beneath the dignity of the Oval Office and the President of America. But second, it shows a pattern of him willing to engage in criticism, name call, and criticize people that he doesn't agree with, which is why his silence in saying white supremacists, KKK, and neo-Nazis was so apparent, because whether it's him talking about the Khans, the Gold Star family, or Ken Frazier, or even depicting a picture of him body slamming the CNN logo, he will go after with fury and vengeance like the world has never seen before people that he disagrees with. But he did not name those specific deplorable groups that cause hate and fear in this country.
He did today, but he initially didn't, and there was a thunderous silence, as his critics have pointed out. Congressman, do you worry that the racist violence we saw over the weekend in Charlottesville will spread to other parts of the country?
Absolutely. That is something that keeps me up at night, and I would just say that I hope it's something that the president, when he's back at Trump Tower this evening, looking in the mirror before he goes to bed, ask himself, did I do or say anything that contributed to this? And what can I say or do to keep this from spreading? And how do I heal this country? He has that responsibility. And I think that if he does an honest assessment of his words and actions over the course of the campaign, he has to say that he's contributed to this divide and has promoted some of the hate and intolerance that we've seen.
Congressman Cedric Richmond, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Will, for having me.
Coming up, why did President Trump wait 2 days to condemn white supremacist groups for the Charlottesville?
To be the platform for the alt-right. Anthony Scaramucci, the short-lived communications director of the White House, told George Stephanopoulos this weekend that the problems were in no small way Steve Bannon's. Take a listen.
The president really wants to execute that legislative agenda that I think is so promising for the American people, the lower middle class people and the middle class people. Then he has to move away from that sort of Bannon-Bart nonsense.
How much do you think Steve Bannon is responsible for saying to President Trump, don't criticize these people specifically, keep it vague?
I don't know what the discussion was, if any, between Trump and Bannon. Certainly, Bannon is someone with a viewpoint that you shouldn't apologize for these sorts of things. But I also don't think that Trump needed to be convinced not to come out and explicitly condemn the groups that he finally came out and condemned today, because we've been in a situation like this during the campaign. Hillary Clinton in August gave a big speech condemning the alt-right, and Trump for having hired Bannon specifically because of these Breitbart connections. And Trump saw no need then to apologize or modulate or get rid of Steve Bannon. And it didn't cost him in the polls. So I think that Trump went into this thinking, you know, I've been through this once before. There's no reason I should have to apologize.
And to be fair to Stephen Bannon, words that I don't often say, in February 2016, Kevin, when then candidate Trump was on my show, and I asked him what I thought at the time was kind of like a throwaway question about the ADL calling on him to vociferously and unequivocally condemn David Duke and the white supremacists who were expressing support for him, and President Trump 3 times refused to. Stephen Bannon had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, and this goes back to an old saying that I've always employed, whether it's been on campaigns or working in administration. Organizations are reflections of their principle. At the end of the day, staff does not matter. And I think, again, this should be another lesson for this White House, that no matter how strong the vice president comes out and says something, no matter how much a family member tweets, whatever language they use, as strong as it is, it doesn't matter until the president himself articulates it to. And that is why nations, as a nation, we have always turned our eyes to that executive to look for a sense of healing or a sense of purpose or a sense of resolve to our presidents. And so that is something that Steve Bannon and some of these internecine battles in the White House are not as important as whether or not the principal says something and says it clearly to the American people.
I would agree, Jake. And I guess I'm also concerned about the speech that Donald Trump gave today. He specifically said, this country was founded on equality for all. And we all know that's not true. The folks who were the white supremacists who were marching in Charlottesville Friday and Saturday were marching because they were angry that the vice mayor introduced a resolution to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee, who was a general of the Confederacy. There are deep-seated ties to white supremacy, like embedded in the systems of our country that we have yet to fully address. In Nazi Germany, folks were put on trial. Reparations were rendered. There are no schools in which children in Germany attend named after Nazi generals. But here in America, our children go to school every day in schools named after generals of the Confederacy. So I don't think the president even fully understands the gravitas of what really happened this week.
Everyone stick around. We're going to take a very quick break. We have much more to talk about on the violence in Charlottesville, the president's reaction, and then his do-over. Stay with us.
The Lead with Jake Tapper, brought to you by Progressive. Drivers who switch to Progressive can save an average of $620.
I make it easy to save $600 on cars.
CNN Breaking News.
Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We have breaking news right now. Charlottesville police will be taking questions and holding a press conference any second now after the deadly rallies and racist violence over the weekend. We're going to bring you the moment that arrives. CNN's Brian Todd is in Charlottesville. And Brian, we're expecting to hear from Chief of Police Al Thomas. Do we have any idea what this press conference is about?
Jake, we don't know what the news conference is about, but there are some key questions that still have not been answered by officials here. They haven't told us about any potential motive for the alleged attack on Saturday. They've not said whether they believe anyone was working with the suspect, James Fields. We have not heard whether Mr. Fields has actually cooperated with them. We do know from Justice Department sources that they believe that there may be enough evidence to be suspicious of him possibly wanting to send some kind of a broader message rather than just harm the individuals who he allegedly hit on Saturday. So some of these other details on, motive, whether he's cooperating, whether others were working with him, may be forthcoming in just a few minutes from the Chief of Police.
All right, Brian Todd in Charlottesville. We'll come back to you as soon as the press conference begins. We're expecting that any second.